Thank you, Steffi. That's quite an introduction. I want to add only one detail to the introduction. The teaching at Tel Aviv University is part of, and that's where I'm going to be running from this lecture. I have to get there to teach at 2 o'clock today. That teaching is part of a special arrangement between Yad Vashem and Tel Aviv University is part of an effort to maintain and expand Holocaust academic instruction and research and promote new research through the teaching of the students and so on. And I've been fortunate enough and tired enough to be the pilot in this project. So pilot and not airplane, right? The pilot in this project, which I think has been successful this semester and I hope will continue with not only me, we have many scholars here who can teach good courses, and I hope that it will continue. Now, I want to begin by saying that where the title of the talk is New Research about the Final Solution, what I'm going to do is actually try to discuss the process of the development of the final solution, where I'll be reflecting some of the research of the last more than a decade that has tried to answer important questions about the final solution, how it developed, and when decisions were taken, or in the way some of the scholars see it, were decisions actually taken? Is there a critical moment where Hitler says, okay, at this point, from now on, it's the final solution to the Jewish question, until now it was something else? So some scholars look at it and wonder even if there was a critical point, or if it's something where Hitler is certainly involved all the time and making decisions all the time, but not necessarily with a critical moment. I'll be reflecting that research rather than saying so-and-so says this and so-and-so says that. Here and there I'll point that out, but that's not the structure. To begin that, I want to actually begin, as is my wont, with two stories. One that reflect the development of the final solution, one from the perspective of the perpetrators, and the other that is both Jews and perpetrators. And I want to begin with something that probably many of you know, and there are many friends of mine here, and friends and teachers and so on. So many of you have also not only are familiar with this very well, maybe even better than I, but might also have heard me talk about some of these things. But still, I'm beginning with August 1st, 1941. On August 1st, 1941, the commanders of several of the murder units operating in an area known as the Pripyat marshes, which is a vast expanse of marshland that is now primarily in northern Ukraine and stretches into southern Belarus along the Pripyat River. The commanders of the murder units operating in that vicinity received an order by wire telling them that from this moment on, what they are to do with the Jews in their areas of operation is to select small numbers of able-bodied young men from among the Jews, set them aside for forced labor, and all the rest, specifically the women and the children and the elderly and the ill, they are to drive into the marshes. The commanders seem to have been, I don't know what the appropriate word would be, surprised, puzzled, taken aback. Maybe taken aback is too extreme. But something about this order gave them pause, at least for a moment, and they sent back a question for clarification. The response came, yes, you've understood correctly, carry out the orders, and they did. They found, however, that these orders were difficult to carry out. The intention, of course, is clear. Push these people into the marshes, and they will sink into the marshes, into the water, because the bottom of the marsh was soft, and they simply will sink in, and then they'll drown. And that would maybe save money, as opposed to bullets. Well, it didn't work. It turned out that the water wasn't deep enough, the marsh wasn't soft enough, and therefore the people weren't sinking and drowning, and it turned out that the murderers had to shoot them anyway, but instead of what they had been doing until then, lining them up at the edge of a mass grave or inside the grave and shooting them by firing squad, they were now shooting at masses of people standing in a disorderly fashion in the marshland, and it was much more difficult for them to carry this out. So after a few tries of this, they decided that this wasn't going to work and they stopped. And I'd like to quote just a couple of sentences from one of the reports. This is by Franz Magil, one of the commanders of one of those units, who wrote on August 12th, summarizing the period of the last 2 weeks of murder in the Pripyat marshes, and he wrote, "The driving of women and children into the marshes did not have the expected success because the marshes were not so deep that one could sink. After a depth of about a meter, there was in most cases solid ground, probably sand, preventing complete sinking." And therefore they went on to, went back to their original method of murder of firing squads. But my reason for telling the story is not that. The reason for telling the story is to, first of all, point out something that has changed, not in the last 10 years, but over a longer period of time in the research, in how we understand the development of the final solution. Because after all, we used to say, when I was studying back in the end of my BA, beginning of my MA, that the murder, the final solution began operatively with the Einsatzgruppen in the Soviet Union. We know that that is not the way it developed. That's the beginning of systematic murder. But even there's a developmental process. And this document, this event of August 1st and the following days and weeks is part of that developmental process. And perhaps part of the pause of these commanders of these murder units in that area in the Pripyat marshes, when they got that order, pushed the women and children, etc., into the marshes, was perhaps because they saw that now their orders had been changed. Because until that point, many of the Einsatzgruppen, most of them, and the other murder units about whom we'll talk in a moment, what they were doing was killing selectively. They were murdering selectively able-bodied young men in the various places that they went to in the Soviet Union. Or if in certain places they would take not the able-bodied young men but leadership figures, rabbis, prominent figures in the community in other fashions, and take them out and shoot them as a way of preventing opposition from developing, or some kind of resistance from developing. And then they'll deal with the rest of the Jews, whatever that meant, later on. Here we're looking at the process of the change in the orders in the Soviet Union. And this is one of those documents pointing to that change. Instead of killing selectively, you leave alive selectively. And now in the Soviet Union, they will be killing more thoroughly in every place. It's not a day where that began, it's a process where orders like this were given from late July throughout the month of August of 1941. It's also possible that these murderers who got that order on August 1st, 1941 hesitated because they now have to kill women and children. Perhaps something about that bothered them as well, although I'm not sure that we could put our finger on such a concern on their part, maybe. The second story I want to tell, though, looks at a different angle of the development of the final solution. And that story begins in Lublin on February 22nd of 1942. A woman whom I imagine you've never heard of, Raisa Borger. She was originally from Brno in what's now the Czech Republic. She was in the Lublin ghetto. She wrote a letter to the German civilian authorities in the Lublin district of Poland via the Judenrat. That's the process. A Jew doesn't turn to German authorities directly, but goes through the hierarchical, bureaucratic process that the civilian administration had created. So she has to go through the Judenrat in order to pass on a request to the German authorities, the civilian authorities. The request was that she be given permission to bring her elderly mother, a 65-year-old woman named Berta Langer, from Brno to Lublin, so that she, the daughter, could take care of her. And she explained, my mother is elderly, 65 years old in 1942 is elderly. It's like being 85 today. There are a few people here who are probably, some I know are past 65. It's a little different world. But she's elderly, she's very ill, she's having difficulty taking care of herself, and therefore the daughter, as a devoted daughter, I'd like to bring her to me to take care of her. She understood that she will not be permitted to go back to Brno to take care of her mother. In order for this permission to be granted, Raisa Borger had to present evidence that she met two criteria. First, that she had a roof over her head and somewhere to house her mother. And second, that she was gainfully employed and had some sort of an income and could support her mother. Apparently, the German civilian authorities in the Lublin district were very concerned that an elderly woman shouldn't be living in the streets and have nothing to eat. An elderly Jewish woman. This must be of great concern to them at the time. So she presented the affidavits, whatever she had to present, it was okayed, and the Judenrat passed on the request. Who got this request in the German civilian government in the Lublin district? Well, it was the Population and Welfare Department, a department of about 12 people, including the secretaries, professional social workers and others, career bureaucrats and so on, department of 12 people that deals with social welfare and population affairs. The head of that department was a man named Richard Turk, interesting name for a German, he or someone in his department approved the request. It was passed on to the German mayor of Brno. Of course, there's no Czech mayor of Brno. The Germans have taken over. So there's a German mayor of Brno. That mayor or someone in his office looked over the request, found everything to be in order, and approved the request, and sent the approval back to Lublin, to Richard Turk's office, on March the 10th of 1942. For some reason that isn't clear to me, it took 10 days for that internal German correspondence among German officials to reach Turk's office in Lublin. March 20th is when it arrived. Of course, we know because there are bureaucracies, so they stamp everything. You can write any date you want on a letter, but the stamp, you could fake that too, I guess, but there's no reason for that in this kind of a case. So the outgoing mail was stamped March 10th, incoming mail stamped March 20th. The Germans weren't as efficient as we might think. When it arrived on March 20th, Turk and his entire department were too busy to deal with this. And it took them another 6 days before they passed on the approval from the mayor of Brno and from Turk's office to the Judenrat to be passed on to Raisa Borger. March 26th, they passed it on. What were they so busy with? Well, they were busy killing the Jews of Lublin. The deportation of the Jews from Lublin to the death camp of Belzec began early in the morning on March 17th of 1942. So here, on the 10th day of that deportation, they've passed on this approval. We know that Turk and his office and others in the civilian administration were deeply involved in planning the deportation and murder of the Jews, first of the Lublin district, and then after that elsewhere in the area of Poland that the Germans called the general government. They were deeply involved in that for a simple reason. They're the population department. They have all the information. Where do the people live? How old are they? What is their profession? Are they working? If so, where are they working? Do we need them? Do we not need them? They have all this information written down. So when the special SS team, under the SS and police commander of the district, DLO Globocnik, needed to organize the roundups and murder of these Jews, which was the pilot, or the prototype, I should say, for the murder of the roundups and murders of Jews in the general government, when they were organizing this prototype deportation, they needed to turn to the civilian administration. And of course, they had to tell them why they're turning to the civilian administration. And then in that planning, you have various civilian officials alongside these, the special team of SS people planning the details of the murder of the Jews. So he was too busy to deal with this request on March 20th. Now, we don't know if Raisa Borger was even still alive when the approval arrived at the offices of the Judenrat in Lublin. And if she was still alive at that point, there's no evidence that she survived, but if she was still alive at that point, we can only try to imagine how she reacted when she got this pleasant letter telling her, "We're pleased to inform you that your request has been approved. Your mother will soon be arriving in hell." Now, how did she react? We do know something more about Berta Langer. Berta Langer was put on some means of transportation on March 31st of 1942 from Brno to Theresienstadt, and then sometime after that, she was put on a train from Theresienstadt along with approximately 1,000 other Jews and sent to Lublin on the way to Belzec. The train stopped in the Lublin station, not the, that is the goods station, not the passenger station, in Lublin, because at that moment when that train arrived, the new camp that had just been constructed and was still continuing to be expanded near Lublin, the one that we now call Majdanek, needed additional workers, a few more able-bodied hands, And therefore, the train was stopped at the station, and people from Turk's office and people from the SS department dealing with the murder of the Jews were waiting there along with guards. And they selected a small number of able-bodied young people from the train to work in Majdanek. Now, we can assume, I think, that the elderly ill Berta Langer was not among those who was chosen to go to Majdanek and be a forced labor, but if she was by some fluke of the German selection, there's no record that she ever survived. Now, why do I tell this story? And I've already given away some of the reasons, of course. First of all, this story is a reflection of who was involved in that developing and planning and then implementing the final solution to the Jewish question. We don't tend to think about secretaries and bureaucrats and social workers as being the people who are planning the murder of the Jews, but they too, in this case. And Turk and his office are one illustration of many. Think about all the different kinds of civilian jobs there were that might have had some connection to organizing the murder of the Jews. Who do we send? Who do we leave behind? Where are they? How do we round them up? What information do we have? What documents do we issue? All these different kinds of people are involved in planning and carrying out the murder of the Jews. So first of all, for that reason. Second of all, this document also, if we want to understand the final solution, we need to also look at the Jews, of course. And we have here a reflection of something that we all know about the Jews. That is, what they did not know. Clearly, Raisa Borger and the Judenrat of Lublin had no idea what the Nazis were about to do. Of course, we know they had no idea. The Nazis didn't report to them. But here you see how that worked. They had no idea, and therefore, just 3 weeks before the murder in Belzec was about to begin for these Jews, this devoted daughter says, "Can I bring my mother to me so I can take care of her?" Totally unaware of what's about to happen. And the Judenrat in Lublin, who are not known from the research that's been done, they're not known to have been the greatest heroes on earth in resisting Nazis or whatever, but they're also not known to have been people who simply hid everything from the Jews and handed Jews over all the time. They were just, a Judenrat. And what we know about them is that they would not have been a Judenrat to pass on such a request if they had this inkling. Not only that, at the very same time that this Judenrat was passing on this request, the Judenrat passed on a different request from the Judenrat itself to a different department in the civilian government, requesting an additional allowance of flour so that the Jews could bake matzah for the upcoming Pesach holiday. Pesach that year, the first Seder, was April 1st, in the middle of the deportations. And they had good reason to think that the German authorities would approve this, because in 1940 for Pesach and in 1941 for Pesach, the German civilian authorities had approved an additional allowance of flour so that Jews could mark the Passover holiday. It wasn't that they were buying 5 kilos of matzah per family, but everybody could have a matzah. They got extra flour for that. So they passed on the request again, totally unaware that this year no one in Lublin would be celebrating Pesach. And in addition to that, there's one more point I want to raise. There are many that we could raise, but one more I want to point to from this story, and that's the question of deception. Clearly, the way this story played out and the way the Germans behaved in this story could lead to deception of the Jews. What's not clear is if that deception was deliberate or incidental. That is, did the bureaucrats, Turk and the Bürgermeister, the mayor of Brno, and all the others involved, did they, upon getting this request, say, aha, we know that we're about to kill the Jews. Turk and his office were even busy planning it. But here we can trick these Jews by pretending that we're dealing with these usual mundane matters in the usual mundane way. Or does bureaucracy, that bureaucracy as well, and in particular in this case, does bureaucracy have the capability of operating on two parallel tracks? The mundane matters are dealt with the official procedures for mundane matters, and when there are special projects, then they do that with special procedures for special projects, and there doesn't have to be any contradiction between the two. Whatever way we interpret how these bureaucrats were working, and of course historians have different interpretations, whatever way we interpret how these bureaucrats were working in dealing with this case, the end result is that the Jews will be deceived because we'll bring your mother and then she can arrive in the middle of the deportations. Having opened with that, I want to now look at the development of the final solution. And I want to get to these points that I was just talking about, these stories in their context. And first I want to mention something that we all know. Anyone who's ever studied the subject of the Holocaust and the development of the final solution or taught it, mention it as something that is more or less passé now. And that is the debate that historians engage in over decades between two schools of thought, the intentionalists and the functionalists. And I'm not going to go into any long explanation about that, because we all know that in this audience, but rather to say that that debate, when did Hitler decide to murder the Jews, Hitler and his advisor, when did they decide? Was it built in to the Nazi party, Nazi ideology, and everything they did was designed to get to the point of murdering all the Jews all along, the intentionalist position, or that the decision to murder the Jews and the whole final solution developed as a function of events somewhere deep in World War II, and it was not their initial intention, the functionalist perspective. What's happened is that, of course, those two schools of thought couldn't convince each other because the documentation was contradictory, and there's no document of Hitler giving anyone orders. Okay, from now on, this is it. The new plan is kill the Jews. No such document was found. And as my teacher, Udo Bauer, will tell us, I think, probably was never written because Hitler didn't write very much, right? And didn't write orders, certainly not of that kind, usually. So it's not surprising that we haven't found the order. And there might not have been a moment in time where there was such an order, as people like the historian Peter Longerich might argue. But by the same token, that whole debate really didn't get to the all of the essence of the subject. And what developed over the last generation of research is new avenues of research that ask questions that the previous generation wasn't addressing as deeply. And that is, reverse it all. Not when did Hitler make the decision, what did people in the field think that they were doing? And what orders did they get day to day, and what things did they do, and what issues did they raise with their superiors? In this dialogue between center, the commanders in the center, and the people in the field, and so on, middle level, lower level people. And the research that's been done about that, alongside other research, regional research and local research and bureaucratic research in different aspects of the bureaucracies and all the different kinds of research that's been done, fascinating material, a lot of it is really excellent research, feeds what I'm about to discuss. So just those few words I said about the intentionalist-functionalist debate, and I will move on from there. And what I want to focus on in this now is primarily the year of 1941. A little bit before, a little bit after, but primarily the year of 1941. And I'll begin that, as I said a little bit before, I'll begin that with December of 1940, when Hitler gave his orders to the Wehrmacht, proving their plans for the invasion of the Soviet Union. And now it's going to be called Operation Barbarossa, giving that approval in December 1940, and now the Wehrmacht and all of Germany is embarking on preparing the invasion. And in preparing this invasion, which was deeply imbued with ideology, all of the things that Nazi Germany did and its policies were deeply imbued with ideology, but now they're going to embark on destroying the Bolshevik enemy. And that was at this, really at the center. And of course, Bolshevik also means Jewish. They're more or less synonymous in Nazi eyes as an aspect of Jewish. That's Bolshevism. What we find, according to the research that's been done over the last couple of decades, is that immediately after the approval was given and the order was given, now prepare the details of the plan and let's get the invasion going, the discourse among senior officers in the Wehrmacht and the discourse among senior officials in the government became more murderous when they talked about the Soviet Union. Destroy them root and branch, uproot them forever. These kinds of terms that implied massive total destruction. That doesn't mean that they had decided on the final solution at that point. Although one historian, just over 20 years ago, a very good historian, Richard Breitman, actually was convinced that that's what that meant when he published a very important book back in 1991 called The Architect of Genocide, about Himmler. He then retracted from there. Once more evidence came to light, he said, no, that wasn't the decision on the final solution. But that discourse was so overwhelmingly murderous and violent that it led him to conclude at that time that this must indicate that they're planning to kill all the Jews. We know that the SS and the Wehrmacht, of course, negotiated. Who's going to have what jurisdiction in the new territory? We know that they reached a deal, more or less, in March of 1941. I want to read a couple of sentences that reflect the arrangement that was being made between the SS and the Wehrmacht, and who's going to have what jurisdiction in the newly conquered territories that they will soon conquer in the Soviet Union. It's a document from Field Marshal Keitel, the head of the Wehrmacht, on March 13th, 1941, where he informs the senior command of the Wehrmacht that within the area of army operations, the Reichsführer SS, that's Himmler, will be entrusted on behalf of the Führer with special tasks for the preparation of the political administration. Within the framework of these tasks, the Reichsführer SS will act independently and on his own responsibility. So more or less what developed was an arrangement between the Wehrmacht and the SS, whereby the Wehrmacht held, of course, supreme security authority, because it's the front, and it's an area of military operations, so they have supreme security authority where there's a front, and whatever distance behind the front is considered to be the front. But within all of that, the Wehrmacht will carve out jurisdictional space, in a sense, for the SS to carry out those special tasks that Hitler was giving them. And special tasks, of course, is a code word for a variety of things, primarily for murder. And the murder victims were going to be communist officials and the like, and people who resist, and Jews. Which Jews? That's not specified there. From what the murder units did when they entered the Soviet Union, we can perhaps guess what Jews they had in mind. Well, even that was not uniform once they entered the Soviet Union. We know then that training of the murder units, the 4 Einsatzgruppen that were trained, was underway late May and June of 1941. On June 22nd, 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union, we know the story, and the Einsatzgruppen entered and began killing Jews, and there was a lot of murder in certain places locally before the Germans arrived by local people, in Lvov, in Kovno, in other places as well, where murder began at local initiative, or in some cases with some encouragement from the Germans invading, but largely carried out by local people initially, before the Germans pulled in the reins. In other places, the murder is the Germans leading the way, selectively. If you read any Isker book from any town in that area, read Judah Bauer's book, The Death of the Shtetl, about all the places he talks about there, what was the Kresy of Poland, or similarly places in Lithuania and so on, what you find is that they talk about the first shchita, the first slaughter of a limited number of people. They took out 100 people, 120 people, 200 people, 70 people from this town, this town, this town, and killed them. And that's what you find in many places in July of 1941, even in August of 41, depending when the place was conquered. And then after that, you find the larger shchita, the larger slaughter happening sometime afterwards. So we see the Einsatzgruppen beginning June 22nd, 1941, but as we know, the Einsatzgruppen were not the only murderers. They didn't kill all those Jews on their own. And I want to point out some of the other units that were sent in and that was part of the plan. The Einsatzgruppen, 3,000 men in 4 battalions, stretching out over the longest front in military history, thousands of kilometers, were not going to kill millions of human beings. It's not possible. They couldn't even take control of the area, even if they're only killing smaller numbers of human beings. So who else is being sent in? Well, right away, with the invasion, a 5th Einsatzgruppe was organized from among the SS and police and the general government. The commander of that 5th Einsatzgruppe was a senior SS officer, the head of particular bureaucracy of the SS, whole formation of the SS and the general government, and the man who participated in the Wannsee conference afterwards in January 20th of 1942, Eberhard Schengart. He's the commander of this battalion of 500 men raised from among the SS and police people in the Soviet Union, and they entered the Soviet Union within a week and a half of the invasion of the Soviet Union. Their job officially was to help out where help is needed. They weren't given a regional assignment as were the four Einsatzgruppen, A in the north, B and C the center, D in the, all the way in the south heading towards Crimea. Rather, they were told, where you're needed, you'll go. But of course, they couldn't be one day in Latvia and the next day in Odessa, so they were, in the end, operating mainly in the center. And part of that battalion, one of their companies, was actually in the area of the Pripyat marshes, and the commander of that, on August 1st, 41, and the commander of that company was one of the recipients of those orders that I started my talk with. We have a 5th Einsatzgruppe. We know that from the Orpo, the German police, 24 battalions, each ranging from between 500 and 800 men, entered the Soviet Union beginning in July of 1941 and fanned out, and basically were doing the same thing as the Einsatzgruppen as best as possible in coordination with the Einsatzgruppen. In other words, we're talking about an additional 12 to 15,000 men that entered. In addition to that, we know that prior to the invasion of the Soviet Union, a new division was being created by Himmler under his direct command that was called, I'll say the name in German, those of you who are taking notes, only if you know German will you get what this is, Commando Staub Reichsführer SS. Doesn't matter what all that means, but it's a special division under his command where he pulled other regiments out of the SS and the police, including a police cavalry regiment, brought them under his direct control, and was going to use this division for all sorts of special things that he wanted to accomplish. But as this unit was getting organized and beginning to enter the fray, you find parts of that division in different important areas of murder, including one of their battalions having been in the Pripyat marshes at the same day on August 1st, 1941, but others dealing with other things in different areas. And because they're a division, they could spread out much more. How many people were in this division? It depends who you read. The German historian Martin Coopers, who wrote a whole book about this a few years ago, says that there were 25,000 men in this division, all of whom were now at the disposal of the murder of the Jews in the Soviet Union, to be part of that. Raoul Hilberg, the late Raoul Hilberg, who reviewed that book and looked at much of the same documentation in order to review it. Hilberg, as you know, had an encyclopedic memory for every document he'd ever looked at. And he read them quickly as well, so he kind of inhaled documents, as he went through his career. So I encountered this when I knew him a little bit. I encountered this when I'd ask him a question, do you know anything about it? He said, oh yes, there's a document about that in the archive of the fire department in Lvov. That's a real story. How do you know that? So Hilberg, in reviewing this book, said, no, he's wrong. It's 18,000, not 25,000, and tried to prevent his evidence. I don't know better than either of them. So let's say it's between 18,000 and 25,000 men. That's a huge number of men who have now entered the fray. And you look at this together. The 5th Einsatzgruppe, another 500 men. The original Einsatzgruppe, 3,000 men. Another 12 to 15,000 policemen have gone in Einsatzgruppen mobile task force type units. And now this other division is available for the murder, another 18 to 25,000 men. And now we begin to see how murder on that scale could be planned, but that's not all. I'm not going to tell you all the different units, but I do want to mention 2 other kinds of units. First of all, of course, there was assistance from the Wehrmacht. Part of the arrangement between the SS and the Wehrmacht was that the Wehrmacht would lend logistic assistance to the SS where it could and where necessary. Truck drivers, cooks, mechanics, whatever. But the Wehrmacht also allowed soldiers, or made available, I should say, soldiers for actual murder where it was convenient, where they're not fighting on the front and they have time and availability. And there were also cases that we know of where Wehrmacht units asked to be involved. Can we please go there and be part of it? We even know, of course, about an entertainment unit who was sent out to entertain the units out there fighting on the front. Their version of Bob Hope. Except that their version is very different, because these guys put down their trumpets and trombones and picked up rifles and shot Jews when they asked, can we be part of this too? It's not everybody in the Wehrmacht who does that, but it's built into the Wehrmacht that these are things that the Wehrmacht can help out with if possible. And in addition to all of that, there's the local people. Ukrainians and Belarusians and Latvians and Lithuanians, Estonians, etc. They're the local people. And those local people, after the initial murders And once the incoming Nazi troops reined in the local people and didn't let them just run amok and kill Jews as they wished, then there's two kinds of participation that we find among these local people. First, there's the local police. Right? The Germans couldn't bring all of their own policemen to take over all the police work everywhere. It also was not wise from their point of view in terms of an occupation policy. Have the local people do a lot of the work. Then they feel like they're running things and not just like somebody is telling them always what to do. And that's important if you want allies against the Soviet Union and against the Jews, especially against the Jews. So you have to give them that sense that they're running things, especially when you don't have the manpower to run things on your own. And after all, the local people know the local people. They speak the language, they know the culture, they know them personally, they went to school together, they go to the same grocery store, they go to the same whorehouse, they know everything together. And therefore, the local police can do police work, where the Germans would be an implant, but all under German command, of course. And the officers are German, but there's local police. Alongside that, there was a whole slew of what was called Schutzmannschaften, auxiliary units, that were organized in battalion-sized strength, roughly 500 men. They were ethnically homogeneous, so there would be a Ukrainian unit or a Lithuanian unit or a Latvian unit, and they were attached to the German mobile units, and they traveled around with the German mobile units, Einsatzgruppen or Orpo or whatever, and they did exactly what those units did. So that the mobile units of the Germans were actually bigger because they were a German unit and often had an auxiliary unit alongside. How do we know who did what, where, and when if we're not looking at a trial after the war? And then we can know from trial material, but how do we know, or if we don't have all the documents available? Another way to know is from a survivor testimony or a diary that might have survived. Because where the Jewish person or another observer who's not involved and is observing as some local person who kept a diary or something, if that person says, in came those Germans, and with them was a unit of people in black uniforms who were speaking Latvian. They might recognize the language but not really know what's going on. That's one of the Schutzmannschaften. But if the Jewish person writing says, and then Antanas, that bastard, went out and shot my mother. Well, that's the local people, either the initial murderers or the local police, and they know them. They're their neighbors. Maybe they were their friends once upon a time, and so on. And then they can actually name them, and you have lots of survivor testimony where they name people, especially in Lithuania. So-and-so did this, and so-and-so did that, and so-and-so did that. And from those lists, of course, sometimes trials emerge many, many years later. So there's much more we can say about all the different kinds of units that participated. But what we've seen so far is that along with the expansion of the murder in the Soviet Union to include all Jews and not limited numbers of Jews killing selectively, that was accompanied by an expansion of the murder manpower. I've mentioned some, not all, of that murder manpower. But in order to understand the development of the final solution, we have to ask additional questions. And that is, when do we see the murder expanding outside of the Soviet Union? And not just a murder operation in the Soviet Union that went from selective to perhaps a final solution for Soviet Jewry in the eyes of the Germans. When do we see it going beyond that? And here I want to point to a number of things. First of all, certain venues of murder and other perpetrators who undertook murder even without the Germans' direct involvement necessarily, such as Romania. The first murder of Jews by Romanian troops began only a few days after the invasion of the Soviet Union by the German army and the Romanian army and the Hungarian army. June 29th in the city of Iași. Massive murder taking place there, and that was the beginning of murder undertaken by the Romanian regime of Romanian Jews and Jews in Ukraine as well, in areas of Ukraine that Romania had occupied. And according to the historian John Antril, the late John Antril, the Israeli historian, more than 400,000 Jews were murdered by the Romanians on their own. Other historians like Radu Ioanid in the United States argue the number is lower. It's closer to 280,000. Again, I don't know better than either of them, but we're talking about an enormous scale of murder that was Romanian. Now, in some of the same areas that the Romanian murderers operated, Einsatzgruppe D, commanded by Otto Ohlendorf, was also operating. And they were so taken aback by the Romanians, their bloodthirsty murder, hacking people to death and all that, that they wrote letters of complaint back to Berlin. What's with these Romanians? You kill because they're Jews. You have to kill them. But what is all this? We also know about Croatia, the independent state of Croatia, that came up under the Ustasha regime, under Italian and German tutelage, but they were an independent regime. And as soon as they came to power in April of 1941, after Yugoslavia had been conquered, they set out to deal with their enemies. Their enemies were Serbs, Roma, gypsies as they would call them, and Jews. They set out to deal with them. Regulations, decrees, laws, confiscations, and murder. Selective murder by the summer of 41, massive murder by the end of the summer and the fall of 41 at Croatian initiative. We also know of murder taking place by the fall of 1941 in Serbia by the Germans with Serbian local collaborators and their input. We also know that inside of the Third Reich, discussions about taking advantage of the situation. Here we have the new East that has opened up for us, for the Germans. Let's get rid of our Jews of the Third Reich. That the discussions of sending Jews from the Third Reich eastward began in the latter part of the summer of 1941. The first deportations from the Third Reich eastward in this systematic deportation began in October of 1941 to the ghetto of Lodz, and then a little while after that, further east into the Soviet territories, to Minsk, to Riga, and ultimately those Jews shared the fate of the local Jews, although it's not clear that in every case that was the initial intention. But we also know that on October 24th of 1941, the Third Reich issued a ban on emigration from the Third Reich. Now think about that. The murder's been going on now for 4 months, yet officially, legally, Jews in the Third Reich could still emigrate. I don't think too many succeeded. But in the eyes of the German authorities, somehow that's still a possibility. And if you read the Wannsee Conference, you see that there's a reflection of that decree of October 24th, where Heydrich opens up the Wannsee discussion, this coordinating meeting about the final solution, by saying the policy has changed from emigration to evacuation. That is, they can't emigrate anymore, that's finished. We now decide to where we're going to evacuate them. Which place in heaven or hell will evacuate them, and so on. But it's a change in the policy. And we see that reflected in these discussions that were going on in Germany. And who were some of the other planners that we know about, who became, some of them at least, the executives of aspects of the final solution? Let me mention a few. DLO Globocnik, the SS and police commander in Lublin, who then later became the commander of Operation Reinhard, the operation to murder the Jews of the general government, and other Jews were added to that as time went on. DLO Globocnik began operating quickly and taking advantage of the situation in the Soviet Union, that is, conquests in the Soviet Union. By July 9th of 1941, if not sooner, that's the first document that I found, at least. July 9th of 41, the training camp for Red Army renegades who joined the Germans, joined him particularly, among the Germans, in Travniki, was already open, July 9th of 41. Now we know that between July 9th of 1941, when the first group of 200 ethnic Germans, Volksdeutsche, from the Red Army were brought over there and were trained, and they later became the drill sergeant for subsequent groups. We know that between then and around May of 1943, something in the vicinity of 5,000 men were trained in Travniki and became part of Operation Reinhard, of ghetto roundups, of mass shootings, of camp, operating the camps, operating the gas chambers, and all the rest. What is not clear is that Globocnik intended that from the moment that he opened Travniki. That is, it's not at all clear that on July 9th, when Travniki began operating, that he's already looking ahead saying, I'm going to kill the Jews of Poland, and I need manpower, so here, let me take these people from the Red Army and bring them over. It ended up being that. We know that Globocnik was an opportunist among all of his many traits. And as an opportunist, it would make sense for him to seize the opportunity to build a private army for whatever might come. Whatever might come. We also know that Globocnik, when that fifth Einsatzgruppe was created, inserted some of his trusted officers into that unit and asked them to report to him directly. What's going on? And we know that those officers and sergeants in the SS who he asked to go into that unit, they all became part of Operation Reinhard later, some of them in central positions in Operation Reinhard. For example, I'll name one, Hermann Worthoff. Hermann Worthoff at the time was an Obersturmführer on the SS, parallel to a lieutenant. He was later promoted a few weeks after he began in the Soviet Union to a Hauptsturmführer, parallel to a captain. Worthoff, when he came back from working in the Soviet Union in the fall of 1941, was then appointed to be the head of the Gestapo department in Lublin, in the Lublin district, which was the biggest SS department in the of all within Globocnik's bailiwick in Lublin. And they were the ones who ended up being the ones who operated in the field in rounding up the Jews of the city of Lublin and then the Lublin district and deporting them to death camps. He also then, later in July of 1942, was the number 3 man in the hierarchy of command in the Great Deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto. The ones who oversaw and organized that deportation was the group that was called by the Germans Commando Lublin, the unit that came from Lublin because they're experienced in rounding Jews up and killing them. And he was the number 3 man in that pecking order who remained in Warsaw for quite some time in organizing those deportations. So he's one of these people that Globocnik sent into the Soviet Union. We also know that Himmler, in one of his many trips to the East, Himmler was traveling all the time. And in one of his many trips to the East, where if he was heading into the Soviet Union, he always stopped to see Globocnik. He really liked Globocnik. Really, really liked him for a lot of reasons, among them Globocnik's creative evil. Very creative in doing grandiose things and in evil. But he was also a great entertainer. He was known to throw great parties, and Himmler liked to see that too, apparently. He stopped in one of these trips to the East in Lublin from July 17th to July 21st, 1941. We don't know everything that they discussed, of course, but 2 orders have survived that are clear orders that Himmler gave Globocnik. One of them was the order to begin building a new camp. That's what became Majdanek later on. And the other order was to begin doing research in the Soviet Union on where to create SS and police colonies that would mark off the new eastern border of the Third Reich, behind which everything would be German. That's from there westward, everything will be German. But where will the new boundary be? And to mark that boundary, we need these garrisons, these garrison towns of SS people with their families and policemen with their families. So do the research and mark that off. Globocnik had already been doing that research inside the general government, and already had marked off Zamość as an area to be cleared out of Poles, certainly of Jews, settled with Germans, those kinds of Germans that we're talking about. Now he's going further east. He sent a number of his men into the Soviet Union to explore, where can we do that? And lo and behold, every one of those that he sent in there took up a senior position in Operation Reinhard afterwards. Not only that, but the ones that we have records about that he sent in to do that research seem to have been, by coincidence or not by coincidence, at the site of a mass murder of Jews when that murder was taking place. One of those was the person who was number 2 in the deportation from Warsaw, and a senior person in Operation Reinhard, a guy named Michelsen. He changed his name. He had a Polish name, but can't be a good German with a Polish name, so he went from Michalczyk to Michelsen. Georg Michelsen, who was in Riga when they murdered the Jews in Rambuli. And after that murder in Rambuli, beginning of November 1941, end of October, beginning of November, he then returned to Lublin with all that experience. So we have Globocnik is one of our people. Of course, we also have Rudolf Hess, the commandant of Auschwitz, whose testimony after the war said that in the summer, Himmler summoned him to Berlin and told him about the upcoming plans regarding the Jews, the final solution, and that Auschwitz was going to be a center of murder, the biggest center of murder, so he should begin making the plans. The problem with this testimony, there are many problems with this testimony. One of those problems is the dating of the testimony, where sometimes he said that that meeting took place in the summer of 41 and sometimes in the summer of 42. And developments at Auschwitz-Birkenau in those two periods could support either of those dates for such a meeting if it happened. And I'll come back to the summer of 42. But one thing we know about 41 is that the first experimental gassing of Soviet prisoners of war, not of Jews, in Auschwitz took place on September 3rd, 1941, using that pesticide Zyklon B. That became the method of gassing at Auschwitz. That doesn't mean necessarily that on September 3rd, after that experimental gassing, which was followed a few weeks later by the first tenders to German construction firms to build the first gas chamber and crematorium in Auschwitz that went out, as I said, a few weeks later, late October 1941, that doesn't mean that they've already decided that, okay, Auschwitz is going to end up killing more than 1 million Jews, and let's start building one after the other, all the gas chambers and crematoria. But clearly you don't do an experiment in gassing unless you're planning on gassing people. This is part of that developmental process. We also know that we have this famous document from Hermann Goering telling Heydrich, one of Himmler's most important deputies in the SS, on July 31st, 1941, appointing Heydrich to begin planning, putting together a feasibility study about the final solution on July 31st, 1941. One thing about that document, that Yakov Lazovic is one of the historians that he uncovered this, is that of course that document, as we might have guessed anyway, wasn't written in one draft on one day and that was it, but rather Heydrich approached Goering somewhere a couple of weeks earlier, saying, to do the things we're talking about, I need a new authorization, because the authorization you gave me in the past, in January 1939, to organize emigration of the Jews from the Third Reich, that's insufficient for what we're talking about now. And Goering said something to the effect of, write a memo and I'll sign it. There are several drafts of that. It was generated out of Eichmann's office. Eichmann, of course, is Heydrich's subordinate. It would make sense for his office to be generating this. And the end result, the July 31st document that Goering signed, was something that was begun in discussion a couple of weeks earlier. So in mid-July, they're talking about a feasibility study regarding the final solution. What Goering wrote to him is, I herewith charge you with making all necessary preparations with regard to organizational, practical, and financial aspects for an overall solution, a Gesamtlösung, of the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. Insofar as the competencies of other central organizations are affected, these are to be involved, and he tells them, report back to me. Heydrich went ahead, of course, and they did that. Heydrich was busy. He was then sent off shortly afterwards to be the new protector, that's their title, of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. So he's very busy with that job. But this research was done, and we'll come back to that in a moment. While all that is going on, Globocnik progressed. Somewhere in the latter part of August, maybe early September of 41, Globocnik created a think tank. Intellectuals within the SS in Lublin. And he posed to them some kind of a problem to solve. If we were to want to kill the Jews here in Lublin, how would you do it? And the think tank sat and they thought, they deliberated and gave him a response within a few weeks. And the response was more or less, the way to do it here is not the way they're doing it out there in the Soviet Union. That's not a good method. What we should do here is, rather than have the murderers chase after the victims, we need to bring the victims to the murderers. And then to kill them within some kind of an enclosed secret installation. At the same time that these discussions were going on, as we know, the so-called euthanasia program, the Operation T4, was temporarily halted in the latter part of August 1941. Following public demonstrations and people being upset in Germany about all this. And all of a sudden there were lots of SS men who were involved in that, lots of staff who were drawing a salary but didn't have a job. And Globocnik, among his many talents, was extremely well connected. He always knew where everybody was at every moment, so that he could say, can I have that unit for my work? Can I have some of that for me? And here too, he got an initial input from the euthanasia program for a method: gas chambers. If you can have gas chambers using carbon monoxide exhaust to kill small numbers of people in the euthanasia program, then all you need is for the engineers to design a bigger gas chamber that will kill more people. It's an engineering problem that it should be easy to solve. And where do you put these special installations that will use gas? Well, obviously they have to be somewhere that is easily accessible if you're transporting people to the murderers. So it has to be on or near a major rail line. But by the same token, unlike the Soviet Union, you don't want witnesses. In the Soviet Union, there were people who heard the shooting, saw the shooting. You don't want that, so you have to have these things built somewhere kind of out of the way. On the rail line, yet out of the way. The first idea that came to mind was a place that had been the site of a series, a whole group of forced labor camps in the summer and fall of 1940 for a forced labor project that Globocnik's men were responsible for. That site was Belzec. And very close to, apparently adjacent to, where the Belzec forced labor camp had been in the summer and fall of 1940, and using some of the trenches that they had dug as border trenches, defensive trenches, they now began to think about that site near today's border of Ukraine as the site of a good place for one of these camps. On a main rail line, certainly an out-of-the-way place. The little village is nearby. Globocnik, as this was being developed, this idea then turned to Himmler and said, I need a meeting to discuss all this with you. He got the meeting, and on October 13th of 1941, Himmler gave Globocnik the green light to begin building the first camp in this project that was going to kill Jews using carbon monoxide gas to build Belzec. Now, there's a debate among historians. Was this the beginning of killing the Jews of the general government, or was this still a limited program? You have a green light to kill the Jews of the Lublin district for reasons that are specific to that part of Poland. There's a debate among historians. Different historians have different ideas. I would argue that it is the beginning of the larger operation, but you take a stepwise approach. Either way, whether it was planned that way or became that, really, in the end, isn't centrally significant, but we see that development. They're now beginning to build that. And somewhere between mid-October and November 1st of 1941, the death camp of Belzec began to be constructed. Parallel to that, the death camp of Chelmno began to be prepared under a totally different SS jurisdiction. Nothing to do with Globocnik, nothing to do with Rudolf Hess. Nothing to do really with the Einsatzgruppen. Well, a connection to the Einsatzgruppen, but not really. It's a separate jurisdiction planning murder by gas vans, vehicles. You drive around and people will be killed. That's a much simpler camp to design. All you need is an automobile company to design the vehicle. There were several models. When they finally got the model that worked right, they now can go ahead and prepare the camp. While all that is going on, meanwhile, Heydrich's team did their feasibility study. And in the course of that feasibility study, they came up with all sorts of numbers of Jews everywhere in the world, focusing on Europe in particular, but they had numbers for Jews everywhere in the world. How many are in Australia? How many are in South America? Everywhere. They have numbers. How many are in Jerusalem? They had all these numbers that they'd written down, but then particularly Europe, that's the current target, preparing that kind of data, preparing information about how to do things, what kinds of research has been done so far, and all of this was prepared by mid or the latter part of November of 1941. Heydrich got the go-ahead, and on November 29th of 1941, Heydrich sent out the first invitation to the Wannsee conference, the Wannsee meeting, that would take place on December 9th of 1941. However, something happened to throw a monkey wrench into the works. Pearl Harbor, but a second thing as well that maybe had less influence in postponing Wannsee, but was certainly significant in German leadership looking at what's happening, and that was the December 5th counteroffensive by the Red Army against the Germans. And in that counteroffensive around Moscow, although militarily it was more or less a stalemate in the end, but that counteroffensive gave the Germans a bloody nose and gave them pause while their soldiers are busy freezing on the Eastern Front. So Pearl Harbor in particular, the declaration of war against the United States by Germany on December 11th and so on. So now there's a state of war. There's a new issue to be dealt with. So they had to postpone the Wannsee Conference because some of the people involved in the conference, like the Foreign Ministry and others, have other issues to deal with. But the preparations for murder, of course, need to continue as scheduled. So where Wannsee was supposed to take place on December 9th, which happened to have been a day after Chelmno opened. They just talked about it later. But it opened and began operations. The construction of Belzec proceeded. The murder in other places proceeded. The planning in other places proceeded. The discussion was postponed. Now there was a very important discovery in Soviet archives, a number of discoveries in Soviet archives and other archives more than a decade ago that led to certain ideas about when Hitler decided on the final solution and placing it in mid-December of 1941 in connection to what I was just talking about. The person who wrote this research initially was a German scholar named Christian Gerlach, and what he found was that, and talked about, was that Hitler had given a speech on December 12th of 1941, the day after the US is now, and Germany are now in a state of war. That speech was to, in the Reichschancellery, to party leaders and some regional leaders of the party and of the government. And we don't have the record of the speech. It wasn't recorded. What we have is several reflections of the speech by participants. Let me read you one of them from the diary of Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, December 13th of 41. And what he wrote was, regarding the Jewish question, the Führer is determined to clean the table. He prophesied that should the Jews once again bring about a world war, they would be annihilated. These were no empty words. The world war has come, that is, the US has now made it a world war. And the annihilation of the Jews must be its necessary consequence. The question has to be examined without any sentimentality. The head of the general government, Hans Frank, was also present at that meeting, and on December 16, 1941, at a meeting of senior officials of the general government, said more or less the same thing. But he also had a sense of humor, so he added, what people were saying then at this meeting. He said, what should be done with the Jews? Can you believe that they will be accommodated in settlements in Ostland, that is in the eastern territories in the Soviet Union? In Berlin we were told, why are you making all this trouble? We don't want them either. Liquidate them yourselves. Gentlemen, I must ask you to steel yourselves against all considerations of compassion. We must destroy the Jews wherever we find them and wherever it is at all possible. We also know that on December 18th, in Himmler's desk diary, his office diary of his meetings, which was discovered in Soviet archives in Moscow about 15, 16, 17 years ago, something like that, and was looked at by Gerlach and other scholars. It's also been published, an annotated edition, but only in German as far as I know, or is it in English already? It's in English? No, okay, it's only in German. We know that Himmler would write down his meetings, and then he would check things off. We discussed it. Occasionally, he would write a comment. On December 18th, 1941, Himmler had a list of things he was discussing with Hitler, and one of them was Judenfrage, the Jewish question. And then next to that, he wrote a comment. In German, he wrote, als Partisanen auszurotten, to be exterminated as partisans, or like partisans, depending how you translate that. Now, putting all that together, there were historians who, after all this became public knowledge and was published in important articles in the latter part of the 1990s, said, aha, here it is, that's the decision. The 12th, the 18th, that period, And what tipped the balance here with all this development along the way was the entry of the United States into the war. Of course, we know that other scholars dispute that and say this might reflect the decision. But the decision came earlier. If you read Christopher Browning, The Origins of the Final Solution, he makes a very strong argument for September, October 1941, for other reasons. I won't go into all the details in the interest of time, but for other reasons that have to do with the development of the war and how Hitler and other his advisors were looking at the developments in the war and the ability to achieve victory in the Soviet Union, which opened up various other opportunities for them, particularly regarding the Jews. And with all this research that had been done, now they had an opportunity to embark on the murder, which is why they could send out tenders for the first gas chamber, and why they could approve the death camp of Chelmno, and why they could approve the death camp of Belzec, all at the same time, because they're looking ahead to that. Whichever interpretation you take of those, or you can reject both interpretations and follow other scholars who argue that neither of those periods, September, October, or mid-December of 41, marks a decision. The decision, if it ever happened, was much later. Whatever you take, what we see is that by the time von Zeh convened this coordinating meeting among various department heads in the Nazi regime, in the SS, and in the government, by the time that convened, a great deal of preparation had already been done, and the final solution was in a well-advanced stage of preparation and, in certain areas, of implementation. By the time von Zeh met, more than 1 million Jews had been killed. Following von Zeh, do we see that von Zeh had some kind of an influence in things that happened in its wake? Or was it just a meeting to discuss things and, and there were all sorts of little details that happened, but not major things? Well, certain things did happen. We know that the deputy governor general of the general government of Poland, Joseph Biller, Frank's deputy, who took part in the meeting, after the meeting sent a telegram to his subordinates in the general government telling them, take a new census of the Jews immediately. And then they set out to do that. Of course, they do that through the Jewish council, so the Judenrat. There's a local official will tell the Judenrat, all right, give me a new count of the Jews, and here are the parameters that I need. The names, the ages, the addresses, whatever it is. They start doing that. Why are they doing that? No, they're doing that because, of course, we know what they're preparing. Biller knows what he's preparing. He even asked at von Zeh, take my Jews first, please. We see that not only in the general government. We see all sorts of things going on from the fall 1941 and after von Zeh in 42 that reflect preparation. Counting Jews, sifting Jews, issuing new IDs for those who work in what the Nazis said was important work. In other words, the ones they might leave behind when they send all the other ones off to be killed. All sorts of things like that were going on. And then in March of 1942, beginning of March 11th, the deportation of Jews from the Third Reich, or in particular in this case from the Protectorate of Bohemia Moravia, Jews begin to be sent into the general government, deported, in order to be put into a position to be taken along with the Jews of Poland who are about to be killed in the death camps that are being constructed. Between March 11th and June of 1942, tens of thousands, probably well over 100,000 Jews, were sent into the general government from Germany, Austria, the Protectorate, Slovakia, and even some trains from other places. But especially from there, and of course it's only the beginning of a larger flood being sent in to be part of that murder operation being planned. We know, as we said, that the deportations from Lublin to Belzec began on March 17th. I began with Raisa Borger reflecting that story. We know that the deportations from Slovakia and France into Poland, in order for those Jews to begin to become part of whatever's being done in Poland with the Jews of Poland, began at the end of March of 1942. The first deportations were for Slovakia. It's the beginning of a massive deportation. For France, it's a few initial transports. The massive deportations are a little bit later. We also know that in the general government in particular, the operation took off in the latter part of the summer of 1942, when Treblinka was online and Belzec was online, with new gas chambers in Belzec ready to go. Sobibor, because of rail construction, was less effective at that point, but the two other ones were sufficient. And we know that between mid-August and mid-December of 1942, when Belzec stopped its murder operations, in those 4 months, in the general government, somewhere in the vicinity of 10,000 Jews were killed every single day. That, too, is based on more recent research, just being able to reach that kind of a number. But for the historians who argue that there was no decision in October 41 or in December 41, if there was a decision that came much later, what are they looking at to say that the decision on the final solution was even after all these camps are already functioning? That is, it was kind of developing, clearly with Hitler's approval, but developing without there having been a conscious moment of decision. What are they looking at? A number of things. And I want to point out only two of a number of factors. One, July 18th of 1942, there were meetings then and over the course of a few days at Auschwitz. Himmler was part of that, where they were discussing various things about Auschwitz-Birkenau, including, okay, the time has come to put out tenders to build the gas chambers at Birkenau. The gas chambers at Birkenau, the main murder center of Auschwitz-Birkenau complex, of course, didn't come online until many, many months later, a year later. They came online. But there they actually are talking with the architects and the commander and other people who need to be involved for clearing the land and all the rest that has to happen. It's happening there. So that is a very important day. And the next day, July 19th, Himmler issued a well-known document, well-known to us today, of course, but I'm putting into this context deliberately, and that was an order that the Jews, the murder of the Jews of the general government must be completed by December 31st, 1942. And I just said that from mid-August to mid-December, 10,000 a day in the general government. So historians who look at a longer process of development till the decision was reached, such as Peter Longerich or Florent Braillard in France, and some others would argue that you can't ignore those meetings and decisions and orders in July of 1942 because they're making decisions that were central parts of the final solution. And that marks maybe another step in the development of that decision-making process. Others would argue that's already, it's difficult to say this, but that's already more in the realm of details. The decision is there. Now they're working on the different venues and improving the process and developing the process, but they've already decided before that. Otherwise, why are they killing millions of Jews? I think from the way I phrase that, you can see where I stand on that debate, but it's a real debate by serious historians who are looking at documents, and we have to grapple with the documents where the decision, again, was never written down. There isn't a moment where Hitler says, do it, and we have some record of that. I want to conclude all of this with a few comments about the Jews. The Jews themselves. Of course, that should be a whole seminar, or at least a parallel lecture, but at least a few minutes. The Jews, of course, were totally in the dark about all this. We know that. They were surprised. In each place, when the deportations began, they're surprised anew, with some exceptions, where they heard from somewhere else and they reached a conclusion it'll happen here too. But generally, in every place, Jews are surprised when it happens, because there's no reason why it should happen. It makes no sense. The murder of the Jews makes no sense, unless you're a Nazi. It makes no sense. We worked for them. We committed no crimes. I'm not sick. Why should I die? There's no reason on earth why they should kill me. Until they start killing. Well, I guess they're going to kill us too. So the Jews are totally surprised. The Jews were deceived because there's active Nazi deception everywhere, all the time. And of course, people tend to believe authority. If the authority, whoever it is, even if you don't like the authority, says, okay, here are the rules. Here's when you cross the street, green light, red light, whatever. Okay, those are the rules. When the authority talks about life and death issues, people living under that authority also tend to believe things until they see evidence that takes the authority's authority away in their eyes. So the Jews are deceived because they're being deceived actively by their murderers. Yet at the same time, Jews all over the place have some information, not all Jews, but Jews all over the place. Some here, some there, some there, have all sorts of information that reaches them about murder there, rumors. Are there rumors or are they not rumors? They're killing all the Jews in that place. No, they sent them off to work. And the elderly are living in an old age home. They're killing them by gas. No, they're killing them by electricity. There are a lot of rumors about that. What's going on? How do they know? And they have to grapple with that. But at the same time, just seeing deportations where they were, seeing the violence in the deportations, even in some cases in Western Europe, just think about what happened in Paris in July of 1942, and the violence. And the violence in Poland, and the violence in the Soviet Union, the massive violence that was part, an integral part of the roundups. Jews, even without understanding anything about the Nazi intentions, just looking at what's happening, would often reach a conclusion, I don't want to be there. I don't know where they're going, or what's going on. That's not good. They're killing people in the streets. We know today, from research of the last decade or more, that when we look at the balance in the final solution between how many were killed in death camps, how many were killed by shooting outside the Soviet Union, other places, Poland and other places, but particularly Poland, the balance between death camps and shooting is a little different from what we originally thought. Far more were shot inside of Poland than we had originally imagined, because the roundups included massive shooting all the time. And Jews who did escape, this is terrible, I need to hide, I need to escape, I'll get a false identity, I'll go to my friend who might hide me. Jews who did that, and many, many did that, were then hunted. In Poland, the German police called it Judenjagd, the Jew hunt. Went on and on for months and months and months. And just look at the police reports. Every county has their own police. You look at the police reports, weekly reports. And where those reports have survived, we look at it and we see, this week we killed 12 partisans and we found 50 Jews. And here we found 37 Jews. And there we found 120 Jews. Take each county, add it up. And what you get is thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people who had fled and were caught and killed, alongside all the shooting murder during the deportations. Lublin, one illustration, March 17th to April 14th, was the operation to deport the Jews to Belzec. There had been approximately 40,000 Jews in the ghetto when the operation began. Approximately 30,000 were sent to Belzec. More than 2,000 were killed in the streets of Lublin. When the operation ended, the Nazis had issued, prior to this, a little more than 3,000, about 3,300 or 400 new ID papers to the Jews who were meant to be left behind. Then they looked around and said, aha, so there are 8,000, you hid, hey? No problem. Everyone come forward, we'll give you new cards. Let's see the card. Everyone who didn't have the right ID, they took them out, marched them to a forest a few kilometers away, the Krempitz Woods, and shot them all. So the 30,000 deported was accompanied by 6,000 or 7,000 shot. Everywhere you find similar kinds of things. Yet Jews try to figure out what to do. And I want to conclude here with a letter from one Jew to another, a secret letter that was written, sent apparently by a Polish courier, it was my guess. It survived because it was copied by the people who maintained the Onyx Shabbat or Onyx Shabbos archive in Warsaw, Emanuel Ringelblum and his whole team, and that remarkable operation that they had prepared for an underground archive so there'll be a record. And I want to conclude with this as an illustration of an effort by one Jew to warn another. One Jew who had seen through and say, if it happened here, it'll happen somewhere else. But what did that mean in the end? Did it affect anything? The letter was written, we don't know the names of the people, because in copying down the letter, the people in the Onyx Shabbat archive didn't copy down the names in order to protect those people. It was written in Yiddish, not very good Yiddish, from someone in Vlodava on June 1st of 1942. And I'm reading this because we're in June, right? 70 years later. So it's my translation from Yiddish. And he writes, "We are, thank God, healthy. We don't know what to do regarding going to the doctor." The doctor, of course, is the Nazis. "We can't decide ourselves, although we had already decided, or it had been decided for us, to be by the doctor. Since Uncle wants, God forbid, to have his children's party by you, God forbid, because he's renting an apartment near you, very near to you, and perhaps you don't even know this, Therefore, I'm writing to you now, and we're sending you this information specially so that you should know. This person is writing a week and a half after the first deportation from Vlodava to Sobibor, where 1/3 of the community had been killed in Sobibor. It is true that you too should rent apartments out of town for all our brothers, the children of Israel. He, that is the uncle, the doctor, has already prepared a new apartment for everyone, the same one he had near us. In case you perhaps don't know of this, I'm writing especially so you'll know, because uncle wants, quote, and he expelled man. In Hebrew, Vayigaresh et Adam, a quote from Genesis, when God expelled Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. Uncle wants and he expelled man. And then you will be together, God forbid, with Shlomo Velvel of blessed memory. We know with certainty that uncle will soon complete the apartment by you. You should know, perhaps you can figure something out. It should be generally known that uncle wants, God forbid, to have a wedding reception. In Yiddish, you can't translate this. A chasana, a big to-do. A wedding reception, soon by you, and the apartment is already prepared, very near to you. Remember, be in your apartments outside town at all costs, so that you won't be with Shlomo Velvel of blessed memory. And for sleeping, the only good fortune is that of he who sits secretly. That's a quotation from Psalms. Yoshev Beseter Elyon. Remember well that we are holy, and that which is left for mourning, etc. That's a quotation. Does anyone recognize the quotation? In Hebrew, it's, for those who know Hebrew, remember that we are Kiddoshim, v'hanotar mimenu ad boker v'chule. Does that say anything to anybody? Right. It's a quotation from Parshat Bo in the book of Exodus. It's the story of the first Passover sacrifice. And the command from God is eat it quickly and eat it at night, and that which is left for morning should be burned. Be out of town. Hide. Because if you're there when morning comes, I don't have to finish the sentence. Thank you.